welcome to Marxism 2021 online, and to this meeting, which is Stay Classy, is the working class still relevant today? So the way that this meeting is going to run, we've got a speaker who's going to speak to us for about 25 minutes, and then we'll have time for contributions from the floor, and then the speaker will come back at the end to sum up again. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we start. So the chat function is disabled just for security reasons, but if anybody does have a question, then you can send a message to the host that may be read out during the contribution section. And yeah, I think that's everything. So I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is, first, my name's Heidi. I'm going to chair the meeting today. And then I'm joined by Jess Walsh, who is a SWP member in South London. Over to you, Jess.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this meeting. Welcome to Marxism Online. I think it's fitting, really, that we're kicking off the first day of Marxism Festival with a meeting about class, because for socialists and for Marxists, class is absolutely fundamental, right? And I think it should inform all the other discussions that we're having this weekend. So to start with, I think in response to the question posed in the title of this meeting, is the working class still relevant? Is class relevant today? I think far from class kind of disappearing from view or being rendered irrelevant in the recent period, I think the crisis of the last year, the crisis of COVID-19, actually revealed how crucial class was and remains as a way of understanding how our society is structured. Following a period of being constantly told from the top of society, from the media, that class is really no longer relevant as a way of understanding the divisions in society, I think two things were revealed in 2020. Firstly, how much class shapes the contours of our society, how unequal it is, how that impacted on your life, your experience of the pandemic. While most working class people, ordinary people, were experiencing kind of disaster in the last year, the mega wealthy around the world made huge gains from the pandemic, adding billions to their already huge amassed fortunes. As I said, while poorer sections of society were experiencing disaster, the pandemic, I think, revealed really the vast inequalities and deep sicknesses at the heart of our society is structured. So just two quick examples, the structural racism that meant that people from Black, Asian, or minority ethnic communities were at least 4 times more likely to die from COVID-19, or the sexism that means that women were being murdered in their home at twice the normal rate in the last year at the hands of an abusive partner, taking on disproportionate amounts of more domestic labor, childcare while working, and all the other, many inequalities that I don't have time to touch on, and the injustices which have been starkly revealed by the crisis. I think secondly, it was shown that the labor of working class people is absolutely essential to the proper functioning of the system, right? As lockdown swept across the world, it was the labor of grocery store attendants, nurses, truck drivers, firefighters, doctors, teachers, postal workers, cleaners, carers, who kept society functioning. It wasn't the bankers, the CEOs, the mega wealthy, it was ordinary people. So while I think it's a difficult argument to make that class is kind of irrelevant as a way of understanding the world, what unfortunately I think is not so commonly accepted is that working class people themselves hold the keys to changing the world. And this is, in essence, the great claim of Marxism, right? That working class people, through their own activity, can struggle collectively to emancipate themselves from capitalist society and therefore liberate the rest of society from class rule. This is the claim that Marxists make about the world and the view that I want to defend in this meeting. Okay, so because class is so fundamental, I think we need to be precise in how we view class as Marxists. What do we mean by the working class? And I think this is often made kind of really deliberately confusing by what you read about class in, the establishment press, or even what you're taught about class in school. Despite what's often written about class, class is not a personal identity. It's not something that's signaled by the clothes that you wear, what kind of dog that you have, how many houseplants you have, where you went to school, if you have like a northern accent or not, or, it's not something that's even particularly determined by your occupation. You know, some of these things flow from class, but they themselves do not determine class. And I would say it's not even determined by how much you earn, whether you're working class or not. Just looking at your income isn't actually the best starting point. It doesn't determine whether or not you experience exploitation, oppression, and whether or not you will fight during struggles. You know, there have been heroic struggles, of course, led by lower paid workers, but some struggles have been led by what would be considered relatively high paid workers as well. So I think income isn't the best starting point either. And I think to understand what we mean by class, we need to return to Marx. So Marx identified class primarily as a social relationship based on exploitation, which is at the core of capitalist society. So it's not, you know, how you think about yourself or how you identify, right? It is about the relationship between groups of people in society, or, you know, the power held by groups of people in society and the relationships between them. It's about primarily the separation between a group of people who own and control what we call the means of production, the factories, you know, the supermarkets, the farms, the offices, the Amazon distribution warehouses, you know, what we would identify as the capitalists. And on the other hand, the group of people who own very little except their ability to labor for a wage. You know, they have nothing but their labor power, which they have to sell to a capitalist in order to survive. And this is what we call the working class. You know, the capitalist needs the labor of workers in order to produce the profits, which they appropriate. By paying workers less than the value that they produce, capitalists accrue wealth and do not need to labor themselves. So, you know, has this relationship fundamentally changed? You know, I would say the world has undoubtedly changed very dramatically since Marx was writing about capitalism, right? But I would argue that the fundamental relationship between those two classes hasn't changed. This remains the key dividing line in society from which everything flows. So for one thing, you know, the working class now constitute the majority of people around the world as capitalism has kind of unfurled its tentacles into every corner of the earth. And, you know, this hasn't always been the case, you know, that the working class are the majority. For instance, when Marx and Engels were first, you know, identified the working class as this class with the power to change the world in the mid-19th century, you know, the working class constituted really a tiny minority of the global population based mainly around, you know, new industrial cities in Western Europe. But they identified that as capitalism grew and expanded around the world, so would the working class. As they say in the Communist Manifesto, the bourgeoisie produces above all its own gravediggers. So now the working class constitutes around just over 2 billion people compared with a few million when Marx was writing. So I would say, far from a Marxist understanding of class being outdated, I think it was incredibly far-sighted. So this is why we talk about the working class. It isn't about dogma. We don't talk about the working class because we fetishize them, but because of the unique place working class people hold and the power that flows from this relationship. The capitalists need the power of working class people, the labor of working class people to produce the profits, to keep the system going, which actually imbues workers with power when they organize collectively, withhold their labor and fight. So this is the major difference between exploitation and oppression. So for instance, like most women, I've experienced sexism and sexist behavior in my life. It doesn't imbue me with any particular power to be on the receiving end of oppressive behavior, but the experience of exploitation is different because of that dependence of capitalists on the labor of working class people. And so this relationship based on exploitation is central and remains at the core of society. You know, there are other classes in society, no doubt, you know, small business owners who may employ, you know, 1, 2, 3 people, family members, etc. They're a minority, a substantial minority, but a minority in society. There is what we call the middle class, again, a substantial minority. These what we understand to be like managers or supervisors, layers of people who do the bidding of capitalists in society, you know, disciplining workers, organizing parts of the workplace, and they can be pulled one way or another, both of these classes, right, they form a layer that can be pulled, for instance, middle class are paid more than ordinary workers, right, managers and supervisors, but they can be pulled into struggle at points by an effective working class movement. However, day to day, right, and most often, you probably know that your manager or your supervisor is probably not on your side, right? They do the bidding of capitalists in, disciplining workers in the workforce and yeah, as I said. So I think that we have to be quite strong and say the central division remains between workers and capitalists. Yeah, that is central to our understanding. So what makes the working class kind of different from other exploited classes in history? You're probably aware that capitalism is not the first class system that was built on exploitation in the history, of humanity. There is, the claim of Marxism is not only that the working class can fight back collectively, that they experience exploitation, they have power, but that by doing that, they can force their vision of society, they can liberate themselves and end the class system and build a society based on mutual cooperation and end exploitation, right? So what makes the working class special? What do they have that, for instance, peasants didn't have, or serfs in feudalism? They undoubtedly experienced exploitation. Societies and economies based on slavery, on slave labor, those people undoubtedly experienced exploitation, right? What makes the working class different in having this particular power, historical power? And really, the working class is a collective class. Firstly, right, as capitalism develops, it encourages workers into large workplaces where they have the capacity to organize. Capitalism needs workers generally collected in large workforces in increasingly large cities that grow and grow. And because of how capitalism organizes production, workers are forced to cooperate, right? To run a train system, you need to work with, with groups of people to organize how it's run. The same if you work on an assembly line, or, you need to work with other people to run a supermarket, for instance. Other exploited classes such as peasants, when they would fight back against their exploiters, they would rise up, kill their landlord and divide land between themselves. I think it's a bit more difficult to do that in a factory where you work with thousands of other people, or a hospital, for instance, right? When the working class rise up, they can have the potential to run a new society based on cooperation and not on exploitation. And I think because capitalism increasingly needs like an educated, healthy workforces in large cities, in bigger and bigger cities, as I said, you have workers living together, working together. They tend to develop their own culture, develop their politics, their vision for the world, and crucially, in moments of struggle, develop democratic methods of organizing that could be the groundwork for a new type of society, a socialist society. So time and time again in revolutions or general strikes, mass moments of fight back, workers create new organs of democracy from the ground up. You saw this in, for instance, the Russian Revolution in 1917, where the working class organized, organized into what we call Soviets, which are workers' councils, where they would organize their workplace, organize the revolution, and this could be the basis for a new type of society. So the working class is collective, and it's the class of people who have the ability and interest to not only end capitalist exploitation for themselves, but actually to end class society and build a new kind of society. So has this changed, right, since Marx was writing? Has the working class lost its power? I think because it's been some years since we've had, a significant strike wave in Britain or the US, or, a confident movement led by working class people, or the organized working class. There are those, I think, even on the left, who have become quite pessimistic about the ability of the working class to fight back and lay the groundwork for a socialist society. You hear it often, don't you? It's either an argument, people are too well off now, that everyone's too middle class, they're bought off by the system, or on the other hand, you hear people are actually too insecure now, too precarious to fight back, they're too downtrodden, too oppressed, or you hear, the old working class, what you think of as the working class of a certain period, you know, the people who worked in manufacturing, in factories, the miners, etc., they've disappeared now. They're no longer around. You know, neoliberalism has destroyed the old centers of working class organization that we think of when we think of working class power. But, you know, does this mean the working class has disappeared? And I would say that capitalism, because of its competitive nature, is constantly restructuring, revolutionizing, and changing production and creating new pools of workers with which to exploit, right? It's true that British capitalism has gone through a major period of restructuring in recent decades in you know, what's known as the neoliberal period. It shut down hubs of industries, you know, the old industrial heartlands, but it's opened up new ones, right? It can't escape from creating new pools of workers, the source of profits, the source of the you know, the motor of the system, workers laboring to produce profits. And these workers, you know, experience exploitation under capitalism, are always driven to organize and fight. And we've seen this again and again. So it's just a few examples I want to run through. So for instance, groups of workers who work in education and healthcare and the public sector more broadly have emerged actually in recent years as being some of the most well-organized workers. And while they aren't, you know, directly exploited as they don't produce a profit, they are disciplined from the wider working class, right? They experience, they are part of the working class and they experience the same exploitative, you know, they experience a push for longer working days, less pay, pay freezes, because, you know, we hear it from Rishi Sunak, don't we? We can't give, you know, health workers a pay rise, for instance, because people in the public sector are experiencing you know, job cuts, pay cuts, etc. You know, people in these industries, they have less control over the work method and their teaching. So, you know, talk to any teacher or lecturer about, you know, what they're experiencing in the workplace, you know, casualisation, academisation, Ofsted, push of testing, marketisation, you know, that creep of neoliberalism into education is spurring more and more resentment, and people are getting more and more organised in these sectors. And this is what we, you know, they're undergoing a process of what is known as like proletarianisation. They're becoming more and more, you know, driven to fight back. And when these workers struggle, they can create, you know, a vast political crisis for our rulers. You know, think of when earlier in this year, the National Education Union in the UK, when COVID-19 was spiraling out of control at the very beginning of this year, they organised mass meetings of tens of thousands, up to 100,000, I think one of the meetings was, and advised their members to refuse to reopen schools, issue Section 44 notices, and you know, they forced the government into a U-turn and implemented a national lockdown. You know, this perhaps saved tens of thousands of lives, and I think it gives you a glimpse of the power of these workers when they're organised, because, you know, children being home from school actually affects large parts of the economy, as parents are, you know, driven to have to look after their children, have to confront the need for welfare. It has a big effect on the economy. So when they fight back, it makes a big difference. I want to say a point that far from manufacturing being destroyed in the current period, the manufacturing workforce globally has actually grown in the last 2 decades. So from 2000, there were 393 million employed in manufacturing globally. And by 2019, that was 460 million. So the manufacturing workforce is growing, not shrinking, what we're being told all the time, aren't we? And if you include, you know, people who work in mining, construction, transportation, communications, what's known as the industrial workforce, right? That has grown to over 1 billion people. So I think far from industrial workers disappearing, they remain a massive core of the working population in the world. The way these workers have been distributed has definitely changed, but they remain vitally important. Actually, the increasingly global nature of production is actually giving some workers more power than they have had in previous periods, especially those who work in some of the really huge logistical hubs that are being created around the world near our cities. So what's known as just-in-time production methods, where things move very quickly through production, through supply lines, through global supply chains, they're being developed, mean that when sometimes when one group of workers strike in a strategic point in a supply chain, they can shut down the productive abilities of a company, not just in one country, but in many. It has a massive impact, and these supply chains are increasingly brittle because they rely so much on speed. So capitalist restructuring can certainly decimate old established sectors of industry and weaken the power of workers that used to be among some of the best organized, as we saw in this country with the defeat of the miners in the mid-1980s. But that same restructuring leads to the growth of new groups of workers, and this is a constant process that capitalism has been going through in its entire history, right? I just want to say a word here about the concept of precarity, right? This is the idea that we all live in a gig economy that is producing a workforce that is far too insecure, far too fragmented to fight back, far too precarious. This is something that's written about not only by those on the left, but in places like The Guardian, some establishment press. I would say it's becoming kind of the common sense, right? We're all live in this footloose economy. We're all working multiple jobs. We have no security, etc. There's 2 points on this. Firstly, there is no evidence actually that there has been a vast increase in casualisation of work in recent decades. So the average time spent in one job by a worker in their lifetime remains 16 years. Thanks for that, Heidi. And this has remained remarkably stable in past decades. And so, yeah, there's a vast, I think, over-exaggeration in how insecure we feel, exaggeration in how widespread insecure and casualised work is, but the core of the workforce remains, quite stable, stay in one job for a long time kind of thing. A second point is obviously we know that there is a significant minority, I think, of new groups of workers working for, places like Deliveroo, working on an app, often young migrant workers. And I would say, the big unions probably aren't doing enough to organize these workers, but unsurprisingly, I would say we've seen in recent years, they're getting organized, often in smaller unions like the IWGB, they're using technology to get organized, Zoom to have meetings, WhatsApp groups, etc. These are people who experience very harsh exploitation, they work below the minimum wage, but, it isn't impossible for them to get organized. And in fact, they are getting organized. There's been strikes, protests led by some of these workers, and the experience of exploitation, which is constant under capitalism, pushes these workers to fight back against what they experience collectively, I would say. So, for all that the working class has transformed, that basic relationship of exploitation remains central and intact. In fact, new groups of workers working in initially unorganized centers such as these, logistical hubs, perhaps call centers, as I said, Amazon warehouses, in finance, have at the moment probably very limited experience of struggle. But as I said, capitalism presses them to fight back. The very logic of capitalism creates discontent among those it exploits and oppressors. And so at some point, this bitterness will explode. The key question is not, whether it will happen, but whether it will prove successful. I think how organized and determined groups of workers are. So yeah, all of this explains why potentially workers can fight back. They have the objective power, they have the capacity, but they may not yet have the experience, the confidence, or the consciousness. The restructuring of industry changes the working class, but it cannot do away with those central features that lead to recurrent waves of class struggle. And there will be struggle again. That's in every decade of the 20th and 21st century that there have been significant struggles, general strikes and revolutions involving and being led by working class people at some point around the world. So we can be sure that they will come again. So just to finish, I think, capitalism is in a crisis of multiple dimensions that is creating growing discontent around the world. In 2019, before the crisis of COVID-19, we saw the resurgence of a new wave of global revolt against neoliberalism in many countries around the world. It was really, against the diminishing expectations of working class people facing economic insecurity and turmoil, climate breakdown, political repression following the global financial crisis and the failure of the system to rebound. And now, for the second time in less than 15 years, capitalism is experiencing another major economic crisis. Fossil fuels are still being pumped into the atmosphere at an accelerated rate. Deforestation continues apace, racism and police brutality and oppression is a persistent feature of modern capitalist societies. I think, probably everyone in this room agrees that the need for change is clear, right? And I think we should be confident that there is fertile ground from which to grow, thank you, just finishing up, from which to grow a strong socialist movement based on working class struggle, a vision of a world that will end exploitation and all the ills that flow from this society. And I think the outcome of these coming struggles, which will come, are very much up for grabs. I hope that I've demonstrated in this meeting that the working class are the force on earth, the only force on earth that is capable of ending the system that is leading us rapidly to disaster. And not only ending capitalism, but creating a new socialist society based on democratic control of production. And this has to be led by the bottom up, where the exploited and oppressed take charge of factories, hospitals, schools, etc. To implement socialism, we need revolutionary change, where working class people can be in control of their communities and control of their destinies, where working class people are not only expected to do all the work, but actually have some say over how society is run. And I think this would involve a vast expansion of democracy into all parts of life. As I said, revolutionary change, not just the very limited and unsatisfactory version of so-called democracy that we've experienced in Britain in the last few days. But yeah, the outcome of this will be very much decided on how organized and determined our side is when confronted with the inevitable struggles that will come. So I'll finish there. Thanks, Heidi.